The P-51 pilot who showed why the Viet Cong fears us more than any American unit. The jungle canopy below me rippled like green water in the humid morning air and through the haze of fuel vapors and humidity pressing against my canopy, I watched something that shouldn't have been possible. Viet Cong fighters, men who had fast B-52 strikes and napalm drops without breaking, were scattering through the undergrowth like startled deer, their AK-47s forgotten in their panic to escape something they couldn't see but knew was there. My P-51 Mustang, that old warhorse from another conflict, shuddered through the sick tropical air at 300 feet, low enough to feel the updrafts from cooking vegetation and to hear the staccato bursts of automatic weapons fire even over the Merlin engine's roar. Then he showed them, shadows that moved wrong, forms that blended so perfectly with trees and vineyards that my eyes had to work to separate human from jungle. British SAS operators, moving through that green hell with a precision that made my skin crawl even from altitude. They weren't fighting like Americans fought, with overwhelming firepower and maximum aggression. They were hunting, patient and methodical and utterly silent, appearing from nowhere to strike and vanishing again before their targets could even understand what was happening. Through my binoculars, I watched a Viet Cong squad leader freeze mid-sp, his head turning frantically left and right, searching for threats that seemed to materialize from the barrier around him. The fear in his body language was so pure, so absolute, that it transcended enemy lines and reached something primal in my own chest. This wasn't the controlled terror of men under bombardment or the desperate courage of those facing superior numbers. This was something deeper, the fear of prey animals who suddenly realize they're being hunted by predators they can't see, can't hear, can't fight. What is showed that they wasn't in any briefing. And it's the reason I stayed silent for decades. If you're here for this story, stay until the end and subscribe so these memories aren't lost. To understand how we ended up above that patch of jungle, watching something no pilot should ever see, we need to go back to a farm in Missouri where a 10-year-old boy heard his first aircraft engine cutting through summer air and looked up to see a barnstormer's Jenny banking lazily over cornfields that stretched to the horizon. That boy was me, and from that moment forward, everything else in my life became secondary to the dream of commanding such a machine. My father called it foolishness. My mother worried it was dangerous. Bad dreams, I learned, have their own gravity, and mine pulled me inexorably skeward through flying lessons paid for with money earned making stalls and bawling through military service that began in 1943 when the world was tearing itself apart and young men with wings were desperately needed. The first time I saw a P-51 Mustang, I was 22 years old and standing on a flight line in Texas, watching morning sunlight turn aluminum into liquid silver. She sat there with the quiet confidence of a thoroughbred, her lines clean and purposeful, her Packard Merlin engine radiating power even at rest. The instructor pilot, a combat veteran named Captain Ayes who wore his distinguished flying cross like it was a burden rather than an honor, walked around her with the reverence of a man showing pilgrims through a cathedral. Gentlemen, he said, running his hand along her wing route, this aircraft will take you eager, faster, and further than anything else in the sky. She'll also kill you quicker than any enemy fighter if you don't respect what she can do. Learn her moods, understand her limits, and she might just bring you home. Those words proved prophetic in ways I couldn't have imagined. The war ended before I could take my Mustang to Europe, but the machine and it banded in that mysterious way that happens between pilots and aircraft when everything works perfectly. Through the late 1940s and into the 1950s, I flew her on mapping missions and border patrols, routine assignments that kept my flight hours current while the military figured out what to do with propeller-driven fighters in an age of heads. When the call came for experienced pilots to serve as advisors in Southeast Asia, I volunteered not from any political conviction about stopping communism, but because the alternative was a desk job that would have felt like dying slowly. Vietnam in 1962 was still a shadow war, fought by advisors and special forces units whose very presence was officially denied. The humidity hit you like a physical blow the moment you stepped off the transport aircraft, sicker that made breathing an effort and turned your flight suit into a personal sauna. The smell was unlike anything he had experienced, rotting vegetation mixed with diesel fuel and human waste and something else, something organic and threatening that he later learned was the smell of a country slowly tearing itself apart. Our base at Tanzonnut was a collection of prefabricated buildings and sandbag revetments that looked temporary but felt permanent, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers that reminded everyone that we were guests in a very hostile land. The briefings were exercises in creative language, full of euphemisms and careful omissions that somehow managed to convey enormous amounts of information without ever stating anything directly. We were advisors supporting legitimate government forces against insurgent activities, conducting reconnaissance missions, and close air support operations that officially never happened. The map showed vast green areas marked only as jungle or contested territory, regions where the normal rules of warfare had been suspended in favor of something more primitive and far more dangerous. It was during one of these briefings that I first heard rumors about units that weren't American, weren't Vietnamese, and weren't supposed to exist at all. Other pilots spoke in whispers about helicopter insertions that happened without radio coordination, about firefights that erupted and ended with suspicious precision, about enemy units that would engage American forces aggressively but would melt away at the first sign of certain other operators. The stories were always second-hand, passed along by crew chiefs and radiomen who claimed to have overheard conversations or seen equipment that didn't match standard issue gear. British weapons, they said. European camouflage patterns. Accents on radio frequencies that weren't supposed to be monitored. The Viet Cong, according to these same rumors, had begun exhibiting behavior that traveled even seasoned intelligence officers. Captured documents spoke of ghost soldiers and jungle spirits who moved without sound and struck without warning. Prisoners described an enemy that didn't fight like Americans, didn't use American tactics or American equipment, but possessed skills that made them more feared than any conventional unit. American troops might level a village with artillery and airstrikes, but these others could make entire squads disappear without leaving bodies or evidence of combat. The psychological effect on insurgent forces was reportedly profound. Units that would eagerly attack American positions would abandon prepared defensive sites rather than risk encounter with operators they couldn't identify or understand. He dismissed most of these stories as combat mythology, the kind of folklore that grows around any conflict where normal rules don't apply. Every war produces its share of ghost stories and monster tales, psychological defense mechanisms that help soldiers cope with fears too large to confront directly. But as the months passed and the rumors became more specific and more consistent, he began to suspect that something real was operating in those green depths, something that our official briefings were careful never to acknowledge. The morning that changed everything began like any other, grey downlight struggling through monsoon clouds while he reflected the Mustang by flashlight, checking control surfaces and fluid levels with the methodical precision that keeps old aircraft and older pilots alive. The mission briefing was routine, close air support for a ground operation in Tai Ninh province, coordinates that placed us near the Cambodian border in jungle so sick that downed air crews were often never recovered. The weather was marginal, low clouds and scattered thunderstorms that would make navigation challenging and enemy identification nearly impossible. But there were anomalies. The briefing officer, normally comfortable with the casual attitude that characterized most advisory operations, seemed nervous in ways he couldn't define. He kept checking his watch and consulting notes that he immediately returned to a folder marked with classifications he had never seen before. The radio frequencies were different from our usual channels, using authentication codes that changed every few minutes according to a schedule none of us had been given. Most disturbing, we were instructed to maintain radio silence except for genuine emergencies, and to avoid photographing or documenting anything we observed on the ground. The flight to the target area took us over landscape that seemed designed to swallow aircraft and air crews without a trace. Jungle canopy stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon, occasionally punctuated by brown rivers that snagged through the green like open wounds. The few clearings visible from altitude were mostly bomb craters from previous missions, perfect circles of devastation that nature was already beginning to reclaim. Flying over such terrain in a single-engine aircraft required a special kind of fight that the Merlin engine would keep running, that the weather would hold, and that if something went wrong, that would come quickly enough to avoid the alternatives. As we approached the coordinates, he could see smoke rising through the canopy in columns that suggested small arms fire rather than heavy ordnance. The radio crackled occasionally with brief transmissions in codes he didn't recognize, voices speaking with accents that definitely weren't American. Ground control vectored us into a holding pattern at 1,500 feet, high enough to avoid small arms fire but low enough to observe ground operations if the jungle canopy broke enough to permit visibility. That's when he showed it. Through gaps in the vegetation, movement that wasn't random or chaotic like typical jungle fighting, but coordinated with a precision that seemed almost mechanical. Small groups of figures, impossible to identify as friendly or hostile from altitude, were moving through the undergrowth in patterns that suggested training far superior to anything yet seen from either American or Vietnamese forces. They moved like water flowing downhill, taking the path of least resistance but always advancing towards some objective invisible to outside the observers. Then the Viet Cong appeared. Even from altitude, their panic was unmistakable. These were fighters who had fast napalm and cluster bombs without breaking, men who would charge machine gun positions rather than retreat, but they were running now with the desperate energy of animals fleeing a forest fire. They burst from concealment and scattered in all directions, abandoning weapons and equipment in their haste to escape something that remained invisible to my eyes. Some of them were looking up as they ran, as if expecting attack from the air, but most seemed focused on threats at ground level that I couldn't locate or identify. I descended to get a better view, pushing the Mustang down to treetop level where the humid air was thick enough to test and the canopy passed beneath my wings in a blur of green that made depth perception nearly impossible. The Merlin engine's roar seemed too loud in the tropical silence, announcing my presence to anyone within miles, but it was beyond caring about stealth or tactical considerations. What I was seeing below demanded closer investigation, regardless of the risks. That's when I finally showed them. British SAS operators, moving through that jungle hell with skills that seemed to transcend normal human capabilities. They appeared and disappeared like smoke, materializing from vegetation that looked too thin to conceal a rabbit, much less a grown man carrying full combat equipment. Their camouflage was perfect, not used the random patterns of American jungle fatigues, but carefully constructed disguises that incorporated living vegetation and natural materials to create optical illusions that fooled the eye even when you knew where to look. But it wasn't a used their concealment that made them terrifying. It was their movement, patient and predatory and utterly silent, like big cats stalking prey that had no chance of escape. They communicated without speaking, coordinated without visible signals, appearing wherever the Viet Cong least expected them with timing that seemed supernatural. When they fired, it was with precision that eliminated threats without wasted ammunition. When they moved, it was along routes that seemed to violate physical laws, appearing in positions that should have required more team to reach than the tactical situation allowed. From my cockpit, I watched Viet Cong fighters freeze mid-sp when they sensed rather than show the presence of hunters they couldn't locate. The fear in their body language was so pure, so primitive, that it transcended political boundaries and military objectives. These weren't soldiers responding to superior firepower or tactical disadvantage. They were prey animals suddenly realizing they were being hunted by predators that operated according to rules they didn't understand. The engagement, if it could be called that, lasted perhaps 10 minutes. Brief bursts of automatic weapons fire echoed through the jungle, muzzle flashes appearing and disappearing like deadly fireflies in the green twilight beneath the canopy. But unlike typical firefights, which involved sustained exchanges between identifiable positions, this was more like an execution carried out with surgical precision. The SAS operators struck where and when they chose, eliminating specific targets before melting back into vegetation that seemed to welcome them like living allies. When it ended, the silence was profound. No wounded crying for help, no radio chatter, no sounds of movement through undergrowth. The jungle had swallowed the violence and returned to its normal rhythms as if nothing had happened. From altitude, there was no visible evidence of combat, no bodies, no equipment, no disturbance of vegetation that would indicate human presence. If I hadn't witnessed it myself, I would never have believed that anything had occurred. The flight back to base passed in a fog of confusion and moral uncertainty. What I had witnessed wasn't a conventional warfare as I understood it, but something more primitive and far more effective. The SAS operators had achieved their objectives without casualties, without collateral damage, and without leaving evidence that could be used against them politically or militarily. They had simply appeared, eliminated their targets, and vanished again, leaving behind only fear and confusion among their enemies. But what disturbed me most was my own reaction. As an American pilot, I was supposed to feel satisfaction at seeing enemy forces defeated, regardless of who accomplished the mission. Instead, I felt something closer to horror at the efficiency with which those men had operated. There was something inhuman about their skills, something that transcended normal military training and entered the realm of the supernatural. They weren't soldiers in any sense I understood, they were something else entirely, hunters who had perfected the art of killing to a degree that made them more frightening than any conventional weapon. The debriefing was unlike any I had previously experienced. Instead of the usual detailed questions about enemy positions and weapon effects, the intelligence officer seemed focused on ensuring that he understood the classified nature of what he had observed. They used phrases like operational security and need to know bases, while carefully avoiding any direct mention of British forces or special operations. The message was clear: what he had seen was real, but it was also a state secret that could have serious consequences if discussed inappropriately. Most disturbing was their apparent lack of surprise at my account. This man had known what he was going to see before he ever talked of, had sent me as an observer to document something that couldn't be officially acknowledged. The operation had been planned at levels far above my security clearance, involving coordination between allies that went far beyond the advisory role we were supposed to be playing in Southeast Asia. He wasn't a combat pilot who had stumbled onto a classified operation, he was a witness who had been carefully positioned to observe and report on capabilities that couldn't be demonstrated through normal channels. In the weeks that followed, I found myself avoiding conversations about the mission, even with other pilots who had flown similar operations. The subject felt too dangerous to discuss casually, too heavy with implications that he didn't fully understand. He began to realize that certain kinds of knowledge created isolation, that witnessing things beyond normal experience could separate you from others as effectively as physical barriers. The easy camaraderie of the officers' club became impossible when you carried secrets that couldn't be shared safely. The war continued around us with its familiar rhythm of briefings and missions and casualties that were reported as training accidents or mechanical failures rather than combat losses. But I found myself watching the jungle differently, wondering what else was happening beneath that green canopy that never appeared in official reports. How many operations were conducted by forces that didn't officially exist? How many victories were achieved by men whose very presence was denied by their governments? The fog of war, he learned, wasn't used about confusion in combat, it was about deliberately obscuring facts that were too sensitive for public consumption. When my tour ended 6 months later, I returned to the United States carrying knowledge that felt heavier than any physical burden. The country I came back to was beginning to question its involvement in Southeast Asia, but the debates I heard in newspapers and on television seemed to miss the essential point. We weren't used fighting Vietnamese communists with conventional American forces, we were part of a larger conflict that involved allies whose capabilities far exceeded anything in our official doctrine. The moral complexity of that reality was something I couldn't discuss with family or friends, even if classification restrictions had permitted such conversations. For years, I told myself that what I had witnessed was an aberration, a single operation that didn't represent broader military policy. The SAS operators had been temporary advisors, their presence in Vietnam a brief experiment that had ended with the American buildup of conventional forces. But as the classified documents began appearing decades later, I learned that such operations had been far more extensive than anyone had publicly acknowledged. British special forces had indeed been active throughout Southeast Asia, conducting missions that went far beyond their official advisory role. The photographs and after-action reports made for uncomfortable reading. The men had watched operate with such terrifying efficiency had been part of a broader program designed to demonstrate capabilities that conventional American forces couldn't match. Their presence had been a message to both enemies and allies about the reach and sophistication of Western military power, delivered through operations that could be denied if politically necessary. The fear they generated among Viet Cong units had been intentional, part of a psychological warfare campaign that recognized terror as a legitimate military tool. But what haunted me most was the memory of those Viet Cong fighters scattering through the jungle like frightened animals. They had been brave men fighting for a cause they believed in, but they had encountered something that transcended their understanding of warfare. The SAS operators and the use defeated them, they had broken something fundamental in their confidence as soldiers. That kind of psychological victory came with moral costs that no after-action report could adequately address. The nightmares started years after the war ended. Quiet dreams were circled endlessly above green canopy while shadows moved beneath with predatory patience. In these dreams, I could see individual faces among the fleeing Viet Cong, men looking up at my aircraft with expressions that mixed fear and confusion and something that might have been pleading. They weren't asking for mercy, they were asking for understanding of what was happening to them, why their world had suddenly become populated by enemies who seemed to possess supernatural abilities. I never found answers to those unspoken questions, partly because the answers were classified and partly because they involved moral territories that I wasn't equipped to navigate. The SAS operators had been doing their jobs with skills that represented decades of training and experience. The Viet Cong had been doing their jobs as well, fighting for independence from foreign control with whatever resources they could muster. Both sides had been playing roles in a larger drama that neither fully understood or controlled. Time as a way of putting such experiences into perspective, but some memories resist the healing effects of years. I can discuss the technical aspects of that mission now: aircraft performance in tropical conditions, radio procedures for classified operations, the tactical advantages of coordinated air and ground operations. But I can't escape the emotional weight of watching men discover that their enemies possessed capabilities that seemed to violate natural law. There was something deeply unsettling about that kind of superiority, something that went beyond military advantage into realms that touched on fundamental questions about human nature and the limits of what civilized nations should ask their soldiers to do. The few men I've encountered who shared similar experiences have been reluctant to discuss them in detail, even decades after the events occurred. We recognize each other through subtle signs, a certain way of watching trailines, an unconscious tension when helicopters pass overhead, a tendency to avoid crowded places where visibility is limited. We're members of an informal brotherhood bound together by knowledge that's too heavy to carry alone but too sensitive to share widely. Most people assume that military secrets involve technology or tactics, information that could have enemies' advantages if disclosed inappropriately. But the deepest secrets, I've learned, are often about capabilities that raise questions civilized societies prefer not to confront. What I witnessed in that Vietnamese jungle demonstrated that democratic nations could produce soldiers whose skills approach the supernatural, men who could inflict terror as effectively as any conventional weapon. That knowledge carries implications about human potential and military ethics that remain disturbing even now. The British SAS operators I observed that they were professionals doing jobs they had trained for extensively. They weren't monsters or sociopaths, but highly skilled soldiers applying their expertise to eliminate enemies who posed legitimate threats to their allies. Their efficiency was a testament to superior training, better equipment, and tactical doctrine refined through years of experience in similar environments. Yet the psychological effect of their operations went far beyond military objectives, creating fear that lingered long after they had departed. I speak now because the men who share those experiences are mostly gone, and because some stories deserve to be told regardless of their classification status or political sensitivity. The Vietnam War produced countless acts of courage and sacrifice that have been overshadowed by debates about policy and strategy, but it also demonstrated capabilities that raised questions about the nature of modern warfare that remain relevant today. What it showed wasn't about American versus British military doctrine, or even about defeating communist insurgency. It was about human beings pushed to the limits of their abilities in circumstances that tested everything they believed about themselves and their enemies. The jungle has reclaimed most traces of that war, growing over landing zones and base camps with the patient persistence that characterizes all tropical vegetation. But the lessons learned there about unconventional warfare and special operations have shaped military doctrine in ways that continue to influence conflicts around the world. The SAS techniques I witnessed have been studied, refined, and passed on to new generations of operators who face different enemies in different environments but apply the same fundamental principles of stealth, precision, and psychological warfare. Sometimes, when I'm flying civilian aircraft over forests that remind me of Vietnamese jungle, I find myself scanning the terrain with old habits that refuse to fade. Part of me still expects to see movement that don't belong, shadows that shift with a natural purpose, signs of predators that remain invisible until they choose to strike. The skills that made those SAS operators so effective haven't disappeared, they've evolved and spread to military units around the world, creating capabilities that make the operations I witnessed seem primitive by comparison. The fear that drove Viet Cong fighters to abandon positions and equipment wasn't irrational or cowardly, it was an appropriate response to encountering enemies whose capabilities exceeded anything in their experience or training. Modern insurgents face similar challenges when confronting special operations forces that have refined the techniques I observed into art forms of devastating effectiveness. The psychological impact of such encounters ripples through enemy organizations in ways that no conventional weapon can match, creating doubt and paranoia that undermines morale more effectively than any bombardment. Yet I can't help wondering about the long-term costs of developing such capabilities, both for the men who possess them and the societies that deploy them. Soldiers who operate at that level of efficiency in taking human life carry burdens that civilian populations can't adequately understand or support. The price of creating such warriors might be bigger than the tactical advantages they provide, measured in psychological casualties that don't appear in official statistics but manifest in suicide rates and family dysfunction that persist long after conflicts end. The P-51 Mustang flew that day was a machine from a simpler team, when warfare involved clearly identified enemies engaging each other with weapons and tactics that both sides understood. Jets have replaced propellers, guided missiles have superseded machine guns, and satellites provide surveillance capabilities that make jungle canopy transparent to modern sensors. But the fundamental questions raised by what we witnessed haven't changed: how much efficiency in killing soul civilized societies pursue, and what are we willing to sacrifice in ourselves to achieve tactical superiority over our enemies? Memory, like jungle vegetation, as a way of growing over events until the original truth becomes difficult to distinguish from the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of what we've experienced. But some moments resist such obscuration, remaining sharp and clear despite the passage of decades. The image of those SAS operators moving through Vietnamese jungle with supernatural grace remains as vivid today as it was that humid morning when he first witnessed their deadly artistry from the cockpit of an obsolete fighter aircraft. The Merlin engine that carried me over that scene has long since been silenced, but its song remains in my memory, a deep, steady rhythm that spoke of controlled power and mechanical reliability in an environment where both were precious commodities. Aircraft engines, like the men who depend on them, are innocent of the purposes they serve, singing the same songs whether they're carrying mail across peaceful countryside or observing the evolution of warfare into something that transcends traditional understanding. If you want more stories from the men who saw war from the sky, subscribe. These memories won't survive without you. What he witnessed in that Vietnamese jungle was only one moment in a larger conflict that tested the limits of human capability and moral endurance, but it was a moment that changed my understanding of what civilized nations could ask their soldiers to become. The fairy show in those fleeing Viet Cong wasn't just about losing a tactical engagement, it was about confronting evidence that their enemies possessed abilities that seemed to violate the natural order they understood. That kind of fear, once experienced, never completely fades, and the men who inflicted it carried their own burdens that no victory could alleviate. The sky remembers everything, but the question remains whether we possess the courage to confront what those memories reveal about ourselves and the prices we're willing to pay for the security we demand. Some secrets are kept not because they're militarily sensitive, but because they force us to confront truths about human nature that we prefer to leave undisturbed. What he showed that day was real, but it was also a glimpse into capabilities that raise questions civilized societies must continue to grapple with, whether we acknowledge them publicly or not.